The first section of this briefing has explained what Sharia is according to the authorities and institutions of Islam, and as promoted most aggressively by the organization known as the Muslim Brotherhood. It's important again to note that not all Muslims adhere to the dictates of Sharia. Many, particularly here in the United States, have no interest in living according to its requirements or in subjecting others to them. The question, again, is whether such Muslims and the rest of us will be able to contend with and successfully counter the ambitions of Sharia-adherent followers of Islam. Our purpose is to try to ensure that outcome. Part 2. The Muslim Brotherhood in America. Civilization Jihad. In August 2004, a top Brotherhood operative, Ismail El-Barassa, and his wife were pulled over when a Maryland Transportation Authority cop observed her videotaping the structural supports of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. An ID check established that Mr. El-Barassa was wanted in connection with Hamas fundraising activities in Chicago. The FBI subsequently executed a search warrant of the El-Barassa home in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. and discovered in a hidden sub-basement there 80 banker boxes containing the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. A number of these documents became publicly available after they were introduced into evidence in the Holy Land Foundation trial, which was the largest terrorism financing conspiracy ever prosecuted in the United States. Parenthetically, the supremacist character of the Holy Land Foundation was evident in its logo, which shows a map of Palestine, minus Israel, with a superimposed sheaf of wheat. The defense in the Holy Land trial did not contest the authenticity of the documents found in the El-Barassa home. Several of these documents laid bare the nature, mission, plans, and infrastructure of the Muslim Brotherhood in America. One of the most illuminating and chilling was the Brotherhood's 1991 strategic plan for its operations in the United States. Entitled The Explanatory Memorandum on the General Strategic Goals of the Group and dated May 22, 1991, this plan was written by a man who was, at the time, one of the top Muslim brothers in the United States, Muhammad Akram. It contains a mission statement for the Muslim Brotherhood in this country that should alarm every American. Put succinctly, the Muslim Brotherhood's purpose in our country is to destroy Western civilization from within by our own hands and the hands of Sharia's adherents. The Muslim Brotherhood's strategy for realizing its mission of destroying Western civilization from within was described in another ominous bit of evidence, an undated Muslim Brotherhood document entitled Phases of the World Underground Movement Plan. An indication of the extent of the Muslim Brotherhood's progress in secretly establishing such a leadership cadre can be gleaned from the 1991 Strategic Plan. An attachment listed 29 groups under the heading, A List of Our Organizations and the Organizations of Our Friends. Even today, the groups on that list still constitute the most prominent Muslim organizations in the country. And the fact that so few non-Muslims are aware of these organizations' ties to the Brotherhood attests to the success of its efforts to wage civilization jihad stealthily in America. For example, the first group listed is the largest Muslim Brotherhood front in the United States, the Islamic Society of North America, or ISNA. It serves as an umbrella group for all the other Brotherhood fronts, including many hundreds that have come into being since 1991. One prominent Ikhwan front, seemingly missing from this list, is the Council on American Islamic Relations, better known as CAIR. The reason it's not listed on this 1991 roster is that CAIR did not come into being until 1994. We know CAIR's Muslim Brotherhood pedigree, however, because the FBI wiretapped the group's organizational meeting in Philadelphia in 1993. It was attended by top members of a group that is on the memorandum's list, the Islamic Association for Palestine. As we'll discuss later, some of those operatives continue to lead care. The second phase of the Muslim Brotherhood's phase plan involves the gradual rollout of the Ikhwan's stealth jihad, including its operatives' infiltration of the government. It's important to note that the Muslim Brotherhood's plan says it has achieved a great deal of success in this respect. In Phase 3, the Muslim Brotherhood makes plain its ultimate objective: conflict and confrontation with the rulers. In other words, the Ikhwan is not nonviolent with respect to its strategy for America. That strategy simply has preliminary phases that would be more accurately described as pre-violent. In Phase 4, the Brotherhood envisions being strong enough to directly confront the government, albeit still through nonviolent means. As with Phase 3, however, the emphasis is on preparation for confrontation and conflict, including, in the fourth phase, through training in the use of weapons, both domestically and overseas, in anticipation of 0 hour. We dare not ignore the Brotherhood's claims that it has noticeable activities in such firearms training. Lest there be any lingering thought that the Muslim Brotherhood is actually a non-violent organization, the nature of Phase 5, in which power is seized, should put it to rest. Now that we've had a look at the Muslim Brotherhood's own playbook for civilization jihad, let's examine 7 of its stealthy techniques for destroying Western civilization from within by our hands. Given the priority the Muslim Brotherhood attaches to the stealthiness of civilization jihad, it should come as no surprise that the brothers strive to keep us ignorant of the threat they represent. The U.S. military has a term for this practice. They call it information dominance. If an enemy can determine how we perceive the threat they pose, they enjoy a potentially decisive advantage. For example, information dominance can determine our understanding of the enemy's threat doctrine. More importantly, failure to recognize the existence, let alone the imminence of a threat, can render you unable to counter it. The famous Chinese strategist Sun Tzu recognized this reality 5,000 years ago. His admonition about knowing the enemy is as valid today as ever. I want to show you several slides that suggest the degree of information dominance the Muslim Brotherhood has achieved over the United States in recent years. They provide a somewhat crude but highly illuminating insight into the successes of this facet of the Ikhwan's civilization jihad in America. This table shows the number of times various words were used by the Blue Ribbon, congressionally mandated 9/11 Commission. It was charged with assessing the attacks conducted on September 11, 2001, by Sharia-adherent jihadists who hijacked 4 aircraft in the hopes of killing many thousands of Americans. Not surprisingly, words like Islam, Muslim, and jihad were used extensively. After this report was published, however, several Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated organizations complained that the government's use of such terms was offensive and that other words should be used to characterize the threat instead. Here's an example of the U.S. government's response, showing the number of times such keywords were used in the approved lexicon for the nation's front line of defense against domestic enemies, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. Here's another illustrative example, the 2009 version of a public document that is supposed to guide our intelligence strategy. Incredibly, the same occurred in the after-action report on the November 2009 massacre at Fort Hood, an attack carried out by a Sharia-adherent Muslim who described himself as a soldier of Allah and who was determined to kill as many of his comrades in arms as possible in the name of jihad. In this case, even the officially improved euphemism, violent extremism, was considered to be insensitive and was not used even once. The Muslim Brotherhood's efforts at information dominance are being powerfully supported by another technique, namely an effort to prohibit, or at least discourage, what the Islamists call blasphemy and slander against Islam, Allah, Muhammad, or their followers. The organization behind a global campaign to enforce Sharia blasphemy and slander laws worldwide is the most powerful multinational entity you probably never heard of. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation, better known as the OIC. It is noteworthy that the background to this logo is a globe that is all green, meaning a world that is entirely Islamic, without any exclusion zones. The same message is communicated by the Muslim Brotherhood's latest seal, with the spinning globe in the background. The green crescent embracing the globe that makes up the renamed organization's new logo conveys the same point. The OIC has 56 member nations with Muslim populations, plus so-called Palestine. After the United Nations, it is the largest multinational bloc in the world, and one that, thanks to the oil wealth enjoyed by many of its members, is the most powerful. Like its partners in the Muslim Brotherhood, the OIC has, for years, been promoting Sharia's supremacy all over the world. One facet of the OIC's campaign to spread Sharia was its adoption of a joint declaration that effectively supplanted the UN's foundational Universal Declaration of Human Rights by subordinating all liberties enshrined in that document to a Sharia code that respects none of them. In recent years, the OIC has made a focus of its international efforts a series of annual resolutions at the UN Human Rights Conclaves. These resolutions have called on UN member states to prohibit and criminalize expression that defames religions, although typically only Islam is specifically mentioned. In other words, the OIC's purpose is to enlist international law, or norms, in the effort to impose Sharia blasphemy laws. In due course, we'll discuss the various ways in which the U.S. government has sought to accommodate this facet of the stealth jihad. Lest there be any doubt that the OIC's efforts to criminalize opposition to Sharia's encroachment in the West are bearing fruit, consider the cases of 5 individuals. One is a parliamentarian in Holland, 2 are journalists and authors from Canada, and 2 others are activists, one from Austria and another from Denmark. All have been subjected to prosecution by tribunals in their home countries, nations that pride themselves on their contributions to Western civilization and their commitment to freedom. Yet those nations have now turned their power on these men and women for having the courage to exercise their right to free speech in the interest of preserving that civilization. An even more extreme case is that of Molly Norris, a cartoonist with the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. In April 2010, the brilliant satirists behind Comedy Central's popular animated South Park program were threatened by Islamists. They had brought down death threats on themselves by portraying Muhammad in a bear suit. Some speculate the so-called Times Square bomber was hoping to destroy, among other targets, the corporate offices of Viacom, which owns the program. Molly Norris proposed that her fellow cartoonists and bloggers show solidarity and protect each other by having an Everybody Draw Muhammad Day on May 20th, 2010. A huge response ensued, with tens of thousands indicating they wished to participate. The outpouring was so great that it unnerved Ms. Norris, prompting her to withdraw from the event and apologize to Muslims. Nonetheless, in July 2010, Ms. Norris was herself subjected to a fatwa by Anwar al-Awlaki, the spiritual leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It called for her murder. The FBI reacted by telling Ms. Norris that she should consider the threat to be real and change her name and appearance, then go into hiding. The Post-Intelligencer fired Molly Norris, and she has disappeared. This whole episode has been an object lesson for other members of the press who might contemplate abandoning the guidelines of the Society of Professional Journalists and the self-censorship they require. What are those guidelines? They were adopted in October 2001 by the Society of Professional Journalists, an organization that amounts to the guild or trade association of the American Press Corps. The following are among the directions American journalists are supposed to apply to their reporting about the so-called War on Terror. Quote, when writing about terrorism, remember to include white supremacists, radical anti-abortionists, and other groups with a history of such activity. Unquote. Quote, avoid using word combinations such as Islamic terrorist or Muslim extremist that are misleading because they link whole religions to criminal activity. Be specific. Alternate choices, depending on context, include Al-Qaeda terrorists, or, to describe the broad range of groups involved in Islamic politics, political Islamists. Do not use religious characterizations as shorthand when geographic, political, socio-economic, or other distinctions might be more accurate. Unquote. Quote, avoid using terms such as jihad unless you are certain of their precise meaning and include the context when they are used in quotations. The basic meaning of jihad is to exert oneself for the good of Islam and to better oneself, unquote. And, quote, ask men and women from within targeted communities to review your coverage and make suggestions, unquote. With relatively few exceptions, the vast majority of the U.S. media has conformed to these directives at the expense of public awareness of the true nature of the threat posed by Sharia and its adherents, and, as a practical matter, in submission to their dictates concerning blasphemy. Suffice it to say that, as these examples suggest, we do not know and are afraid to say who we are fighting and why they seek our destruction. We risk certain defeat unless we stop ceding information dominance to the stealth jihadists. Another technique used by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists to advance their civilization jihad in the United States involves demanding favored treatment for Muslims and other concessions to them, whether as individuals or as a community. These are a few examples of such concessions that have been demanded and, in some cases, granted in various places around the country. A particularly egregious concession occurred in Minneapolis-St. Paul when, in 2006, the Metropolitan Airport Authority proposed arrangements that would have allowed Muslim cab drivers to refuse to carry blind passengers with seeing eye dogs on the grounds that Sharia-adherent cabbies considered dogs to be haram or impure. This cartoon nicely captures the implications of such concessions. Stealth jihadists understand, as did their communist mentors, the importance of penetrating and subverting their enemy's educational system. School systems across the country are under pressure to accommodate Islamist demands for official legitimation, preferential treatment, and opportunities for proselytization. In November 2011, one of America's foremost opponents of Sharia, Act for America President Brigitte Gabriel, described how our educational system is being subverted to advance this facet of the civilization jihad.
What's been happening with the universities, with the education system, is because of the oil wealth in the Middle East, the Muslims have been able to pour millions of dollars into our universities, setting up Middle East study department and political science department, and appointing Arab professors who are anti-America and anti-Israel, who are brainwashing our students into believing America is bad, Israel is evil, and we've got, they are embarrassed and apologizing for the country. Here is the extent of the Saudi peddling that has taken place in our country. King Fahed of Saudi Arabia has donated $20 million to set up a Middle East study department at the University of Arkansas. $5 million donated to Berkeley's Middle East department from 2 Saudi sheikhs linked to Al-Qaeda. Harvard received $22.5 million. 28.1 million went to Georgetown. 11 million went to Cornell. 5 million went to MIT, 1.5 million to Texas A&M, 1 million to Princeton. Rutgers received 5 million share endowment, as did Columbia, who tried to lie to conceal the source of the fund. Other recipients of Saudi-tainted monies include UC Santa Barbara, Johns Hopkins University, Rice University, American University, University of Chicago, USC, UCLA, Duke University, Syracuse University, Howard University, and many, many others. I can go on and on. You get the picture. From the Ivy League to the community colleges and everything in between. We pump the gas and they pump poison into the hearts and minds of our future generation. And this is why we must become energy independent and cut off the money thing to the Saudi.
A major facet of the civilization jihad is directed at members and institutions of other faiths. They are targeted assiduously and exploited in various ways. For example, leaders of other faith communities have proven to be tremendously susceptible to suborning by Islamic supremacists engaged in proselytization through gambits like these. The stealth jihadists clearly relish the prospects for converting or undermining the infidel faiths that, according to Sharia, must be made to submit to Islam. Even more valuable is the help they have received from well-intentioned leaders of Christian, Jewish, and other religious communities who are unwittingly assisting in that sectarian triumph. They are doing so by lending their prestige and political clout to Ikhwan-led efforts to suppress so-called Islamophobia and other forms of fitna or resistance. This is all the more absurd since one of the most influential Islamist ideologues, Sayyid Qutb, wrote in his seminal book Milestones, quote, "The chasm between Islam and the unbelievers is great, and a bridge is not to be built across it, so that the people on the two sides may mix with each other, but only so that the infidels may come over to Islam," unquote. All of the Muslim Brotherhood operatives engaged in interfaith dialogue understand this guidance and conform to it. A particularly astounding indication of the incoherence of some of the Islamists' Christian dialogue partners, and evidence of the success of efforts to bring people of the cross over to Islam, is evident in the phenomenon of Chrislam. As Christians believe Jesus is the Son of God, while the Quran says he is simply a prophet, one who will be responsible, no less, at the end of days for killing Christians and Jews as unbelievers. It's hard to see on what foundation this particular bridge melding the two faiths can be constructed. But as this sign outside a church practicing Chrislam makes clear, it is very much a one-way traffic pattern. One of the most insidious and successful instruments of civilization jihad is an industry known as Sharia-compliant finance. Most Americans have never heard of Sharia-compliant finance. Were they to ask a financial advisor about it, they would likely be blithely assured that it's just a form of socially responsible investing, a means simply of respecting Muslims' religious preferences and practices. Notably, these are said to preclude interest and investing that would involve transactions associated with other activities considered haram or impure and prohibited under Sharia. That would seem to make Sharia-compliant finance an unobjectionable counterpart to mutual funds and other financial arrangements provided for various Christian denominations and Jews. But what if the Sharia-compliant finance industry, which by some estimates now has $1 trillion under management, is something very different, and far from being unobjectionable, is quite ominous? One indicator of the true nature and implications of Sharia-compliant finance can be found in one of its most fundamental attributes. In order for government agencies or private sector entities such as commercial banks, investment banks, hedge funds, and so on, to assure that their financial activities are Sharia-compliant, they must secure the approval of one or more recognized Sharia authorities. Not surprisingly, such Sharia authorities are Muslims, who are not simply knowledgeable about Sharia, they fully adhere to it. They are committed to Sharia's supremacy and regard it as part of their obligatory practice to help achieve its triumph worldwide. They recognize that Sharia-compliant finance can be useful for that purpose. And by virtue of their status, in some cases serving at the same level as corporate directors, These authorities have access to proprietary information and an ability to exploit it in ways that serve their subversive Sharia agenda. As it happens, one of the most prominent and influential of these Sharia authorities is none other than Sheikh Youssef al-Qaradawi. He's the same Islamist ideologue who the government of Egypt allowed to address a massive crowd in Tahrir Square last February, and while there, invoked that crowd to liberate Jerusalem. The inadvisability of having such a man anywhere near the centers of Western capitalism is reinforced by several of his other attributes. For one, he is the spiritual leader of an organization whose mission is to destroy us from within by our own hands. For another, he regularly uses his television program, reportedly Al Jazeera's most popular show, to call for the murder of Jews, even Jewish women and children, as well as the death of American troops and other non-believers. Even more astounding is the fact that Qaradawi has explicitly described the tithing, or zakat, generated from the proceeds of Sharia-compliant finance as jihad with money. This reality should be evident insofar as Sharia directs that fully 1/8 of a faithful Muslim's zakat should go towards jihad. An even larger percentage of such tithing would fall under what is considered material support for terrorism, including notably contributions to the families of so-called shaheeds, martyrs, who die in the course of jihad. Given this personal history and public stances, it is astounding that Western capitalists and governments have turned a blind eye to both Qaradawi's role in Sharia-compliant finance and to the danger this financial industry poses by design to our economy, civilization, and security. Even more astounding is the fact that Sharia-compliant finance has now penetrated America to such a degree that the federal government owns the largest purveyor of Sharia-compliant insurance products in the world. AIG, a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the U.S. government's ownership of a company promoting a religion, has established that over $1 billion of the taxpayer bailout went directly into the company's Sharia-compliant division. Under the circumstances, this might be a better logo for the company. Another technique for bringing Sharia to the United States is to insinuate it into American jurisprudence. A study done last year by the Center for Security Policy examined a microcosm of 50 cases at the state appellate level. In each case, either the plaintiff or the defendant sought to invoke Sharia law to adjudicate the dispute. In 27 of those cases, in 23 states, either the trial judge or the appeals court upheld the use of Sharia. The majority of these 27 cases involved family law. Inevitably, American women and children who happened to be Muslim were denied their rights under U.S. or state statutes. Specifically, they were deprived of their rights with respect to property, child custody, divorce arrangements, and sexual relations because of the dramatically inferior status women and children have under Sharia. Perhaps the most outrageous example of these cases of the submission of American rights to Sharia involved a New Jersey woman's appeal for a protective order against her husband. Subsequent to the publication of the Center for Security Policy study, a new website was created by a group that believes Sharia should be used in American courts. This Sharia Index lists more than 70 cases where Sharia was cited in U.S. court proceedings. The Sharia Index lists some of the same cases identified in the Center's analysis. Unlike the Center's study, however, the Sharia Index applauds the pro-Sharia rulings and in some instances misrepresents the facts. The two assessments agree on one thing, however. Sharia is in American courts. Unfortunately, new and ominous ground was broken with respect to the judiciary subordinating Americans' constitutional rights to Sharia in a courtroom in Pennsylvania on February 22, 2012. assault charges had been filed against a Muslim immigrant who attacked a man costumed as what he called a zombie Mohammed during a 2011 Halloween parade in Mechanicsburg. The presiding judge, Mark Martin, ridiculed the victim as a, quote, doofus, unquote. Judge Martin declared that he found the victim's expression, quote, offensive, unquote, and while, quote, you have that right, you are way outside your boundaries or First Amendment rights, unquote, to engage in it. He observed, seemingly approvingly, that it was a crime punishable by death in Muslim, quote, society, unquote. Then he ruled that, quote, the plaintiff has not proven to me beyond a reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty of harassment. Therefore, I am going to dismiss the charge, unquote. If this travesty is allowed to stand, it will greatly advance the effort to impose Sharia and that doctrine's blasphemy laws in the United States. Finally, civilization jihadists understand that all of their other techniques are more easily and effectively employed if they have friends, or better yet, their own operatives, in high places. As we have seen, the Muslim Brotherhood's phased plan calls early on for the use of influence operations to advance its goals. Team B2 concluded that the Muslim Brotherhood has aggressively put this guidance into practice. Indeed, the Brotherhood's operating principle seems to be leave no stone unturned when it comes to targeting and penetrating key parts of our government at federal, state, and local levels, and America's civil society institutions, all for the purpose of destroying Western civilization from within, by our own hands. The influence operations tradecraft employed by the Muslim Brotherhood has been well honed by previous totalitarian ideologues and their followers. Indeed, much of the influence activity at the core of the Muslim Brotherhood's civilization jihad in America seems to have been lifted directly from the playbook of the Communist International and KGB. This is, as the Soviets used to say, no accident, comrade. During the Cold War, Soviet agents and universities trained Arab communists, anti-colonial nationalists, and other radicals in techniques for waging war against their more powerful adversaries. These included guerrilla warfare, cadre building, and influence operations. The skills cultivated in the Arab radicals of yesteryear were passed along to their successors, the Islamists. Here's how President Reagan's advisor on the Soviet Union, Dr. John Lunchowski, described the connection between yesteryear's ideological subversives and today's.
During the Cold War, the Soviets were deeply involved in training, giving communications assistance, ideological assistance, intelligence assistance to radical terrorist groups, and there was a distinct there's a distinct lineage in terms of how the Islamists use power, and it derives very much from a Leninist methodology. One can also say that the end justifies the means morality that is employed by the radical Islamists is almost identical to Lenin's end justifies the means morality, where it's a rejection of the existence of any objective moral standards and the assertion that whatever helps the revolution, or here, whatever helps the caliphate, is moral, and whatever hinders it is immoral.
We'll discuss in the following sections of this course numerous examples of the Islamists' success in penetrating and influencing targeted communities in this country. For the present purpose, a single example will suffice. This photograph was taken at a Friday prayer service in the U.S. Capitol complex. These events draw outside guests as well as Muslims on the congressional staff. Unfortunately, a number of the participants are the sort of people who should not be anywhere near, let alone in, the nation's corridors of power. For example, in 2002, Anwar al-Awlaki was a guest imam for the Congressional Muslim Staffers Association. At the time, he was the imam at Dar al-Hijra, a Sharia-adherent mosque in the Northern Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. In that capacity, he not only ministered to 9/11 hijackers, he espoused Sharia and promoted Jihad, just as he subsequently did as the spiritual leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The latter role earned him a slot on the U.S. kill or capture list and resulted in his liquidation by an American drone strike in Yemen on September 30th, 2011. Next, we'll do a deeper drill down on the civilization jihadists' efforts to penetrate and suborn one of its highest priority targets in U.S. civil society, the American right.